The morning of May 16th, 1943, dawned gray and violent over the North Atlantic, where Capitan Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein stood in the conning tower of U-156, watching the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars as his boat pitched through 12-foot swells that threatened to sweep unwary crew members into the black water below. The wind carried the smell of diesel exhaust and unwashed bodies, the submarine having been at sea for 43 days without respite, hunting Allied convoys along the shipping lanes that connected America to a Britain fighting for survival. Hartenstein had sunk 4 merchant vessels on this patrol, 18,000 tons of cargo that would never reach English ports, and his crew moved with the confident efficiency of men who believed themselves masters of an invisible domain where death arrived without warning from beneath the waves. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But on this particular morning, something had changed in the mathematics of submarine warfare, though Hartenstein did not yet know it. 6 miles to the southwest, beyond the curve of the Earth's horizon, the USS Bogue steamed at the center of her escort group, her flight deck loaded with 24 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 9 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. She was one of the new breed of warships that would fundamentally alter the Battle of the Atlantic, a converted merchant hull designated CVE-9, an escort carrier whose sole purpose was to provide air cover for convoys in the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft could not reach. The Bogue had been commissioned just 3 months earlier, in February of 1943, and her air group had been training relentlessly for the mission that defined their existence, finding and killing German U-boats before those submarines could devastate the merchant ships carrying the material that would determine whether the Allies could continue fighting. Hartenstein's U-156 was a Type 1C boat, 176 feet of pressure hull, and diesel engines capable of diving to nearly 800 feet, armed with 22 torpedoes, and a crew of 48 men who had trained for years to operate in the harshest environment on Earth. According to documentation preserved in the German Federal Military Archives and referenced in the 1987 study U-Boat War in the Atlantic by Dr. Michael Gannon, German submarine commanders in early 1943 still operated under tactical doctrines developed during the first years of the war, when Allied anti-submarine capabilities had been relatively primitive. These doctrines emphasized aggressive surface attacks at night, using the submarine's low profile and superior surface speed to approach convoys, fire torpedoes from multiple positions, then escape. Before escort vessels could organize effective counterattacks, the Wolfpack tactics that had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines in 1942 depended on submarines operating on the surface most of the time, diving only when aircraft or warships forced them under. A U-boat could make 17 knots on the surface, but only 7 knots submerged, and its batteries allowed sustained underwater operations for perhaps 90 minutes, before requiring a return to the surface to run diesel engines and recharge. The Atlantic had been a relatively safe hunting ground for German submarines because Allied air coverage had been limited to narrow zones around Britain and North America, leaving a vast mid-ocean gap where U-boats could operate with relative impunity, surfacing to charge batteries and transmit radio reports without excessive fear of air attack. Werner Hartenstein understood these tactical realities intimately, having survived 23 combat patrols since 1940, sinking over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping. He was 34 years old, a career naval officer who had joined the Reichsmarine in 1933, before the Nazi Party had fully consolidated its control over Germany's military institutions. His service record, preserved in Kriegsmarine personnel files and cited in Clay Blair's comprehensive 1996 history, Hitler's U-Boat War, described him as a methodical commander who avoided unnecessary risks, who maintained strict discipline among his crew, who calculated attack probabilities with mathematical precision before committing to engagements. He was not motivated by ideology, but by professional competence. by the ancient naval tradition of disrupting enemy commerce through guerre de course, by the simple fact that sinking Allied ships was his job and he intended to do it well. But the Atlantic was changing in ways that made Hartenstein's accumulated experience increasingly obsolete. The escort carriers that began appearing in late 1942 and early 1943 represented a technological and tactical revolution that German naval headquarters had not adequately anticipated. These ships were not fleet carriers designed for offensive operations against enemy navies, but rather specialized platforms whose singular purpose was to extend air coverage over convoys throughout their Atlantic transit. The USS Bogue displaced 11,000 tons, carried 33 aircraft, and could steam at 18 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the 12-knot merchant convoys she protected. Her air group operated in rotation, maintaining continuous combat air patrols that could detect surfaced submarines at ranges up to 30 miles, far beyond visual detection distance from convoy escorts. The morning of May 16th began routinely for Hartenstein, who had surfaced at 0400 hours to charge batteries after spending the previous day submerged, tracking a westbound convoy that his hydrophone operator had detected the night before. The ocean was empty in all directions, the nearest Allied ships at least 20 miles distant based on sound ranging calculations. Standard procedure called for remaining surfaced for 6 hours, running diesel engines at full power to recharge the massive battery banks that powered the electric motors during submerged operations. The watch crew scanned the horizon continuously, 4 men with binoculars searching for the telltale masts of approaching warships or the more distant sight of smoke from convoy funnels. But they were not looking up. At 0532, Lieutenant Hans Becker, the junior watch officer, noticed something unusual in the northwestern sky. A dark speck against the gray clouds, moving in a pattern that suggested neither seabirds nor random debris. He called Hartenstein's attention to it, and the captain swung his binoculars upward, tracking the object for perhaps 15 seconds before his mind processed what his eyes were seeing. Aircraft, single engine, low altitude, approaching on a direct intercept course at approximately 150 knots, distance estimated at 8 miles. Closing rapidly. Time to impact, 3 minutes. Perhaps slightly more if the aircraft had not yet spotted the submarine's dark silhouette against the white-capped ocean. Hartenstein's training took over, bypassing conscious thought to activate responses drilled through endless exercises. Alarm! He shouted into the voice pipe, the single German word that every submariner dreaded and practiced. Aircraft approaching from northwest. Dive! 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 Below in the control room, the chief engineer was already slamming levers that opened vents in the ballast tanks, allowing seawater to flood into the spaces that had been blown clear with compressed air to provide surface buoyancy. The diesel engines shut down with mechanical finality, their roar replaced by the high-pitched whine of electric motors driving the propellers. The bow planes tilted downward, forcing the submarine's nose toward the safety of depth. Men scrambled through hatches, the watch crew dropping down the conning tower ladder with practiced speed, while Hartenstein remained topside for the final seconds, scanning the sky to track the aircraft's approach, calculating whether they had been spotted, whether the pilot had already begun his attack run. The dive from surface to periscope depth normally took 45 seconds in a Type 1C boat, though that assumed the submarine was ballasted for diving and the crew executed the procedure perfectly. From periscope depth to 80 meters, where the boat would be relatively safe from depth charges, required another 2 minutes. That gave Hartenstein approximately 3 minutes total from the moment of aircraft detection to reaching a depth where his submarine might survive an attack. But the aircraft was closing at 150 knots, covering 2.5 miles per minute. 8 miles divided by 2.5 equaled 3.2 minutes. The mathematics was brutally simple.
If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this.
The race between dive and attack would be decided by seconds. Hartenstein dropped down the conning tower hatch when the bridge deck was already awash. seawater sloshing around his boots as he descended. The hatch slammed shut above him, dogged down by the last man through, and the submarine groaned with the stress of forcing thousands of tons of steel and equipment beneath the surface through brute mechanical force. Depth? Hartenstein demanded, gripping the periscope column to steady himself as the boat tilted at a steep angle. 12 meters and descending? The diving officer reported, his voice professionally calm despite the tension crackling through the control room. Bow planes hard down. Stern planes neutral. Speed 7 knots. The hydrophone operator, Obersteuermann Gustav Muller, pressed his headphones tighter against his skull, listening to the sounds of the ocean through sensitive microphones mounted in the submarine's hull. Single aircraft, bearing 320, range closing rapidly, he reported. Engine noise increasing. He spotted us. He's definitely spotted us. Hartenstein moved to the periscope, raising it just above the waves for a final visual confirmation. The aircraft was clearly visible now, perhaps 3 miles distant, diving toward the position where U-156 had just disappeared beneath the surface. It was a Wildcat, the stubby fighter that had become ubiquitous in the Atlantic over the past months, and it carried depth bombs under its wings, visible even at this range as dark cylinders that would soon be released to plunge toward the submarine's pressure hull. Take her to 80 meters, Hartenstein ordered, lowering the periscope and stepping back from the column. All ahead full. Left full rudder. We need separation from our dive point, the submarine responded sluggishly, her bow tilting down more steeply as the diving officer fought to maintain control during the emergency descent. The crew moved in practiced silence, each man focused on his specific duties, but Hartenstein could see the tension in their faces, the knowledge that they were racing against an enemy who had detected them and was now positioning for attack. Modern depth charges could be set to explode at depths up to 200 meters, and while the pressure hull could theoretically withstand nearby explosions, if they were not too close, a direct hit or near miss could rupture seals, crack welds, flood compartments, or worst of all, damage the diving planes or rudders that allowed the submarine to maneuver. Historical records from the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare operations, documented in the official history, the Battle of the Atlantic, published by the Naval Historical Center in 1994, reveal the systematic nature of escort carrier operations against U-boats, aircraft. Launched from carriers like the USS Bogue, typically operated in coordinated patrols that covered sectors radiating outward from the convoy at distances of 20 to 40 miles. Each aircraft carried 4 depth bombs, smaller versions of traditional depth charges optimized for air delivery, each containing 350 pounds of Torpex explosive. The bombs were designed to be dropped in a pattern called a stick, with intervals calculated to blanket an area approximately 150 feet long, accounting for the submarine's potential movement during the bomb's fall time and the delay before the weapons reach their preset detonation depth. The Wildcat pilot attacking U-156 was Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Chambers from Duluth, Minnesota, age 23, who had joined the Navy in 1941 and completed flight training in 1942. His combat report, filed after returning to the Bogue and preserved in the National Archives, described the attack with clinical precision. He had been flying a sector search pattern 30 miles northeast of the convoy when he spotted the submarine's dark silhouette against the ocean surface at approximately 0530 hours. The U-boat was fully surfaced, apparently unaware of his approach, until he was within 8 miles, at which point the submarine began an emergency dive. Chambers immediately pushed his Wildcat into a shallow dive, accelerating toward the target at maximum speed, knowing that every second of delay allowed the submarine to reach deeper water where depth bombs would be less effective. Inside U-156, the crew counted seconds in their heads, each man calculating how deep they had descended, how much time remained before the first bombs arrived. The hydrophone operator continued his narration, providing the only sensory information available about the threat approaching from above. Aircraft overhead. Engine noise very loud. He's circling. No, he's straightening out. Attack run. He's making his attack run now. Hartenstein braced himself against the plotting table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. There was nothing more he could do. The submarine was diving as fast as physics and engineering allowed. The evasive turn would hopefully move them away from the position where they had submerged, though the aircraft pilot would surely account for that possibility. Now it was simply a matter of depth and luck, whether they had descended far enough that the depth bombs would explode too far above them to cause critical damage. The first bomb struck the water almost directly above the submarine's last known position, entering with a violent splash that was clearly audible inside the pressure hull. It sank rapidly, its streamlined shape minimizing water resistance, falling at approximately 25 feet per second toward the depth setting the pilot had selected. Chambers had set his bombs to detonate at 100 feet, HUI compromised depth designed to catch submarines during emergency dives when they were typically between 50 and 150 feet below the surface. Too deep for surface weapons, but not yet deep enough to be safe from air-delivered ordnance. Depth 40 meters, the diving officer reported, and then the first bomb exploded. The pressure wave struck the submarine's hull like a massive hammer, the entire boat ringing like a bell struck by a giant. Light bulbs shattered throughout the vessel, plunging sections into darkness until emergency lighting activated. Men were thrown against bulkheads despite their grip on handholds. The hydrophone operator ripped off his headphones, the explosion through his sensitive equipment painful enough to cause permanent hearing damage if he had kept them on. Hartenstein felt the deck heave beneath his feet, the submarine twisting in the water from the force of the explosion. And for a terrible moment he wondered if the pressure hull had been breached, if seawater was already flooding into compartments, if they had seconds left before the ocean crushed them into oblivion. But the hull held. The second bomb exploded, closer this time, the pressure wave actually causing visible deformation in the control room's overhead pipes, and still the hull held. The third bomb was farther away, its explosion muffled by distance and depth. The fourth bomb, the last in Chambers' stick, detonated more than 200 feet from the submarine's actual position, Hartenstein's evasive turn having moved them just far enough to avoid the center of the pattern. The diving officer fought to maintain control. As the submarine bucked and twisted from the concussive forces, water temperature variations created by the explosions, causing unexpected buoyancy changes that threatened to send them plunging below crush depth or back toward the surface, where the aircraft was surely still circling, ready to attack again. "Damage reports," Hartenstein ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The reports came back from each compartment: minor leaks in the forward torpedo room, electrical failures in the galley, cracked gauge glass in the engine room, but nothing critical, nothing that would prevent them from maintaining depth and continuing evasive maneuvers. They had survived the first attack, but Hartenstein knew this was merely the beginning. The aircraft would remain overhead, tracking their position through the slight disturbance their passage made in the water, calling in additional aircraft from the carrier, directing surface escorts to their location. What had been a routine battery recharge had become a fight for survival, and Hartenstein understood with crystalline clarity that the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. The concept of escort carriers providing continuous air coverage for Atlantic convoys had been discussed by Allied naval planners since 1941, but implementing the concept had required solving numerous technical and logistical problems. According to research documented in the 1979 study, The Escort Carriers in World War II, by Dr. William T. Weisblood, the primary challenges involved converting merchant hulls into functional aircraft carriers quickly and cheaply enough to produce them in numbers sufficient to protect every convoy crossing the Atlantic. Traditional fleet carriers took years to build and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Escort carriers needed to be constructed in months at a fraction of the cost, while still providing effective platforms for anti-submarine aircraft. The solution involved converting existing merchant ship designs, adding flight decks, and minimal aircraft handling facilities, while retaining the basic propulsion and hull structure of cargo vessels. The first American-built escort carrier, USS Long Island, commissioned in June of 1941, proved the concept was viable. By early 1943, American shipyards were producing escort carriers at an astonishing rate, commissioning new vessels every few weeks. The British had developed their own escort carriers, converting grain ships and other merchantmen into auxiliary carriers that could operate fighters and anti-submarine aircraft. These vessels transformed the Atlantic from a submarine-friendly environment into a killing ground where U-boats increasingly faced detection and destruction before they could attack convoys. Werner Hartenstein had been briefed on escort carriers at his last visit to U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France, in March of 1943. The intelligence officers had shown reconnaissance photographs of these vessels, explained their capabilities, warned that Allied air coverage was expanding rapidly into zones that had previously been safe for surfaced submarines. But warnings in a comfortable headquarters building could not convey the visceral reality of being hunted from above by aircraft that appeared with almost no warning, that could attack before a submarine could dive to safety, that transformed 3 minutes from the time between detection and security into 3 minutes of desperate vulnerability during which a single mistake or mechanical failure meant death for every man aboard. Lieutenant Chambers circled above the submarine's dive point, watching the expanding rings of disturbed water from his depth bomb explosions. He could not see the submarine itself, the water being too deep and dark for visual penetration at periscope depth or below, but he knew approximately where the U-boat was located based on the oil slick that had appeared on the surface, likely from ruptured fuel bunkers or damaged seals. He transmitted a contact report to the USS Bogue, providing coordinates, submarine type, if he could determine it from his brief visual sighting, course, and speed estimates, and his assessment that the submarine had survived his initial attack and was attempting to evade deeper underwater. The Bogue's operations officer received Chambers' report and immediately began coordinating additional aircraft to the contact position. 2 more Wildcats armed with depth bombs launched from the carrier within 4 minutes, catapulted from the flight deck with steam-powered launch systems that accelerated them from 0 to 65 miles per hour in less than 100 feet. A TBF Avenger carrying sonobuoys, newly developed acoustic sensors that could be dropped into the water to track submarine movements through their engine noise, launched 6 minutes after the initial contact report. The operation was unfolding with mechanical precision, the result of months of training and doctrinal development that had transformed anti-submarine warfare from an opportunistic activity into a systematic hunting process. Inside U-156, Hartenstein maintained depth at 80 meters, moving at reduced speed to minimize noise, following a zigzag course designed to confuse any attempts to track their position from above. The damaged control parties had temporarily sealed the leaks, though the forward torpedo room continued to take on water at a slow but steady rate that would eventually become critical if they could not surface to pump it out. The more immediate problem was power. The emergency dive had prevented them from completing their battery recharge, and they had perhaps 90 minutes of underwater operation remaining at their current speed before the batteries would be exhausted and they would be forced to surface regardless of the tactical situation above. Hydrophones? Hartenstein asked, hoping that the aircraft had departed or at least moved far enough away that they could risk returning to periscope depth for a visual assessment. Gustav Miller, the hydrophone operator, had replaced his headphones and was listening intently to the sounds carried through the water. Multiple aircraft engines, he reported. At least 3 distinct sources. They're orbiting our position, maintaining station overhead. I'm also hearing... Wait. Yes? Destroyer screws. Fast propellers. Bearing 270, range decreasing. The surface escorts are coming. They must have been vectored to our location by the aircraft. This was the tactical coordination that had made the Atlantic so dangerous for U-boats in recent months. Aircraft from escort carriers detected submarines and prevented them from diving to safety, then directed surface warships to the contact position where they could conduct sustained depth charge attacks. The submarines were being squeezed between threats from above and below, unable to surface because of aircraft. Unable to remain submerged indefinitely because of batteries and surface warships hunting them with increasingly sophisticated detection equipment, the mathematics of survival had shifted decisively against the U-boats, though many commanders like Hartenstein were only beginning to understand the full implications of this technological and tactical evolution. Historical analysis of U-boat losses, documented extensively in Axel Nistle's comprehensive 1998 study, German U-boat losses during World War II, reveals that escort carriers played an increasingly decisive role in the Battle of the Atlantic starting in spring of 1943. In the first 4 months of that year, Allied forces sank 56 U-boats, with aircraft from escort carriers accounting for 12 of those kills, nearly 22% of total losses. By comparison, land-based aircraft and surface warships each accounted for approximately 30% of U-boat losses during the same period, with the remainder caused by mines, submarines, and other factors. But the escort carrier contribution was growing rapidly as more of these vessels entered service, and their air groups developed more effective tactics. The USS Bogue herself would become one of the most successful anti-submarine platforms in the Atlantic, her air group eventually credited with sinking 13 U-boats over the course of her operational career. But on May 16, 1943, she was still relatively new to combat operations, her air group still learning the complex choreography of coordinated anti-submarine warfare. Lieutenant Chambers and his fellow pilots were working out procedures that would later be codified in tactical manuals, discovering through trial and error how to most effectively detect, track, and attack submarines that had only minutes of vulnerability between their detection and their escape into deep water. Werner Hartenstein faced a decision that had no good options. He could remain submerged, hoping that the aircraft overhead would eventually exhaust their fuel and return to their carrier, allowing him to surface and escape the area before additional aircraft arrived. But the hydrophone operator's report of approaching destroyers suggested that option was closing rapidly. Surface warships could maintain contact indefinitely, using sonar to track the submarine's position even at depth, conducting methodical depth charge attacks that would eventually find their target through sheer persistence, if nothing else. Alternatively, he could attempt to evade at high speed, using his remaining battery power to put distance between his boat and the aircraft overhead. But high speed running underwater drained batteries exponentially faster and created noise that made sonar tracking easier for surface warships. Or he could fight. U-156 carried a 20mm anti-aircraft gun and a 37mm gun on her conning tower, weapons designed for surface combat against lightly armed merchant vessels, but theoretically capable of damaging aircraft if the submarine could surface and bring the guns to bear before aircraft could attack. This option was essentially suicidal against multiple aircraft and approaching warships, but it had the advantage of at least allowing the crew to fight for their survival, rather than waiting passively for depth charges to crush them in the darkness below. How long until the destroyers reach effective sonar range? Hartenstein asked his executive officer, Oberleutnant Zurse Friedrich Schwartz, who had been calculating intercept times on the plotting table. 15 minutes at their current speed and bearing, Schwartz replied. Perhaps 20 minutes before they can establish solid sonar contact and begin attacking. The aircraft are our immediate problem. As long as they remain overhead, we cannot surface without being immediately attacked. The reality of escort carrier operations was that aircraft rotated in coordinating patterns that maintained nearly continuous coverage over a submarine contact. As one aircraft approached its fuel limit and needed to return to the carrier, another would arrive to take its position, creating an aerial blockade that could last for hours. The submarine's only real chance for escape came if weather conditions deteriorated enough to prevent aircraft operations, or if night fell and visual detection became impossible. But it was currently mid-morning, and the weather, while overcast, was not severe enough to ground carrier aircraft. Hartenstein was trapped, and the trap was tightening with each passing minute. The second and third Wildcats arrived overhead 20 minutes after Chambers' initial attack, their pilots immediately establishing patrol positions that ensured continuous coverage of the submarine's estimated location. The TBF Avenger began dropping sonobuoys in a pattern around the contact area, establishing an acoustic net that would register any submarine movement within their detection range. The technology was still relatively primitive by later war standards, the sonobuoys being simple hydrophones suspended from floating buoys that transmitted signals back to the aircraft on radio frequencies, but they were effective enough to track a moving submarine if properly positioned. The Bogue's operations officer was coordinating the hunt from the carrier's Combat Information Center, plotting aircraft positions, fuel states, and contact reports on a large board that represented the tactical situation. Additional aircraft were being prepared for launch to relieve the fighters currently over the contact, ensuring that the submarine would face continuous air coverage for as long as necessary to either sink it or force it to surface, where surface warships could engage. This was the systematic approach that was turning the Battle of the Atlantic in the Allies' favor, not through individual heroism or superior technology alone, but through coordinated operations that leveraged multiple platforms and capabilities to create tactical situations where German submarines had no good options. Hartenstein listened to the hydrophone operator's reports, building a mental picture of the forces arrayed against him. Multiple aircraft overhead, possibly 4 or 5 by now, orbiting in patterns that suggested they were tracking his movements through methods he did not fully understand. The destroyers were close enough now that their propeller noise was clearly audible, the characteristic fast-turning screws of warships, built for speed and maneuverability rather than efficient cruising. He estimated 3 surface vessels, probably destroyer escorts designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare, each carrying depth charge racks and throwers that could deliver dozens of high-explosive charges in coordinated patterns. The pressure hull groaned with the stress of depth and the earlier explosions, and Hartenstein wondered if there was damage he could not see, microcracks in welds that would gradually worsen under pressure until they failed catastrophically. The crew moved quietly through the submarine, speaking in whispers when necessary, each man acutely aware that sound traveled through water far more effectively than through air, that any unnecessary noise might give away their position to the sonar operators listening from the destroyers above. Battery status? Hartenstein asked the engineer. 60% remaining at current drain rate, came the reply. Perhaps 70 minutes at this speed before we must reduce to minimum propulsion. 2 hours maximum before we have no choice but to surface. The clock was running against them, and there would be no dramatic last-minute escape unless conditions changed dramatically in their favor. Hartenstein had commanded submarines long enough to know when a tactical situation was hopeless, and this situation was rapidly approaching that threshold. The morning of May 16, 1943, continued its inexorable progression toward noon, and Werner Hartenstein remained trapped beneath the Atlantic surface, circled by aircraft he could not see, hunted by warships equipped with detection gear he could not evade. The 3 minutes that had defined his vulnerability during the emergency dive had expanded into an indefinite siege where time itself had become his enemy, where every passing minute brought him closer to the moment when his batteries would fail, and he would have no choice but to surface into the weapons of the forces waiting above. The mathematics of submarine warfare had changed, and Hartenstein was beginning to understand that he was operating under obsolete assumptions about what was possible and what was survivable in this new tactical environment. The doctrine that had served him for 3 years, the confidence that a submarine properly handled could evade detection and escape from dangerous situations through superior seamanship and technical knowledge, was crumbling under the weight of new realities that German naval headquarters had not adequately prepared him to face. The escort carriers were not just another weapon system to adapt to, but rather a fundamental change in the nature of Atlantic operations, a change that meant submarines could no longer surface safely in mid-ocean, could no longer charge batteries without constant fear of aircraft, appearing with almost no warning, could no longer rely on the vast emptiness of the Atlantic to provide security through distance and isolation. Inside U-156, 48 men waited in the darkness of reduced lighting, each breathing carefully to conserve oxygen, each thinking private thoughts about families they might never see again, about the irony of drowning inside a steel tube designed specifically to operate underwater. They had trained for this moment, had practiced emergency procedures until they became automatic responses, but training could not eliminate the fundamental fear of being hunted in an environment where humans could not naturally survive, where the ocean itself was as much an enemy as the ships and aircraft hunting them from above. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.